President Joe Biden has warned Russia that there would be clear and severe consequences if Russia were to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. But what if that thin red line was crossed? What if the US and Russia were to go to war over Ukraine? 2 hours before war. Somewhere in western Ukraine, a Ukrainian base hosting several dozen American trainers comes under attack from Russian missiles. This is where America had been training Ukraine's conventional and special forces for the last 8 years, and where US trainers now work hand in hand with their Ukrainian counterparts to get 100,000 Ukrainian reservists ready to fight in the east. The attack is symbolic more than anything, Russia flexing its muscles and warning the US to back off from the war in Ukraine. However, a lucky missile strike happens to hit the American barracks. 15 American soldiers die from the Russian attack, 1 hour and 45 minutes before the war. The casualties are quickly confirmed and relayed back to Washington, D.C. via the U.S. military's advanced extremely high-frequency satellite network. The constellation of 6 satellites sits in geostationary orbit and relay data via jam-resistant communication links for the US, Canadian, Australian, Netherlands, and British militaries. News of the casualties are on the president's desk just 2 minutes after the attack occurs. President Biden immediately calls for an emergency session of Congress, 15 minutes before war. The deaths of U.S. service members is unacceptable to the American people. Russia has been warned that any attack against American supply convoys or personnel would be an attack on America itself. With a few dissenting votes, the American Congress approves a formal declaration of war against Russia, with the stated intent of neutralizing Russian forces inside Ukraine and preventing them from re-entering the country. 5 minutes before war. Addressing the world and the nation via the White House Oval Office, President Joe Biden announces a declaration of war by the United States of America against the Russian Federation. He makes it clear that the military objectives of this war are to neutralize Russian forces in Ukraine and liberate the eastern occupied regions. U.S. ground forces will not be entering into Russia itself. This is an attempt to limit the escalation of hostilities and prevent an immediate escalation to nuclear conflict. As the president is delivering his remarks, the United States military is already on the move. War, Hour 1. From the decks of U.S. ships across the world's oceans, SM-3 missiles modified to carry out anti-satellite attacks fire into the sky. Their targets are Russian military and civilian satellites that help provide communications and GPS navigation to Russian military units. American F-15s aid in the attack, launching their own anti-satellite missiles from high altitude. The attacks are limited and focused. Destroying a satellite in orbit causes a massive debris cloud that can damage or even destroy friendly satellites. Russia, which also has been preparing for the possibility of war with the U.S. ever since the start of the invasion in Ukraine, responds with its own attacks against American satellites. However, Russian weapons are greatly limited in number. Only 2 of the American advanced extremely high-frequency satellites are neutralized in this way. By comparison, Russian GPS is rendered completely ineffective due to kinetic strikes and electronic attacks against the Russian space network. American ships and cruise missile-laden submarines in both the Pacific Ocean and Baltic Sea launched several additional salvos, this time targeting Russian ground and naval infrastructure. Within minutes of President Biden's declaration of war, hundreds of American missiles are streaking toward targets in St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, and the Pacific naval bases of Kamchatsky, Magadan, Petropavlovsk, and Sovetskaya Gavan. An American submarine, having secretly transited into the Black Sea weeks ago, launches its own attacks against Russian naval facilities in Sevastopol and occupied Crimea. Russian air defense units detect the incoming barrage of missiles and begin to go to work. S-400 and older S-300 units track the incoming missiles. American cruise missiles are subsonic and easy prey for advanced air defenses, and Russia boasts some of the best in the world. However, this first salvo is immense, and while dozens of American cruise missiles are destroyed, some manage to slip through the blistering barrage of air defenses to hit their targets. Air defense radars are primary targets for the U.S. Navy, but Russia has defended these well, knowing that the U.S. retains the advantage in the air. Only a few U.S. missiles find their mark, punching holes in the Russian air defense network of Kaliningrad, where most of the strikes have been focused. In the Pacific theater, more U.S. missiles find their targets, given the thinner air defenses there. With the war in Ukraine going poorly for Russia, critical air defense units have been stripped from Russia's less important Pacific theater to bolster its defenses in the east. Most of the Russian ports in the Pacific are rendered unusable. The Russian Navy has a fraction of the capabilities of the U.S. Navy, and its ships are being kept close to home, where they can enjoy the cover of air and ground-based defenses. However, some Russian submarines are on the prowl in the Atlantic and Pacific, and the hunt for these Russian infiltrators is on. By the end of the first hour of the war, U.S. troops in European bases are being recalled from leave for mobilization. NATO holds a hasty assembly, but most of the member nations do not wish to invoke Article 5. This was, after all, prompted by a strike on a Ukrainian facility that happened to hold American trainers. Only Poland agrees to join the American war effort, mostly out of necessity. Poland borders Kaliningrad and Belarus both, and will be pushed into the crosshairs of the Russian military anyway, as it's the only place the US can stage a push into Ukraine. Hour 3. A barrage of Russian missiles is detected incoming at high speed by long-range airborne and ground-based air defense radars in Poland. The targets are Polish air bases where U.S. Air Force troops and aircraft are stationed. Missiles inbound from Kaliningrad are more difficult to defend against, given the faster flight time have managed to evade U.S. and Polish air defenses in the region. The U.S. has positioned Patriot batteries in Poland since the start of the war in Ukraine, but these have been tasked with protecting the Polish Aegis Ashore facility that even now is nearing completion after years of delays and construction challenges. Poland is one of NATO's most important states, given its proximity to Russia and the Russian enclave in Kaliningrad. This means that the powerful Aegis Ashore facility will one day be the cornerstone of one of the most robust missile and air defense networks in the world. But that day is not today, and the facility is still not operational. Russia pummels the construction site with long-range missiles, but missile defenses manage to stem the bulk of the tide. A few slip through, causing some moderate damage that will ensure the facility will not be completed before the end of the war. Polish air bases also take a pummeling, but the ferocity of the strike is not as great as it was feared to be. That's because Russia has exhausted many of its precision weapons in the fight against Ukraine, and crippling sanctions have made resupply impossible. Russia produces almost none of the sophisticated electronics its advanced missiles need, and what started as a massive stockpile of thousands of missiles has been severely reduced. Any that remain will be needed to counter U.S. forces inside Ukraine itself. Hour 8. Aircraft from across U.S. air bases both at home and abroad take to the sky. They're moving to European airfields from where they'll be able to support the offensive against Russian forces on the ground. America's vast fleet of 650 tanker aircraft, the largest in the world, flies orbits around the Atlantic Ocean, allowing shorter-range F-15s and F-16s to make the transit to Europe from the homeland. Hour 36. U.S. mobilization is ramping up, and troops are preparing to move equipment and personnel into transport ships for the journey across the Atlantic. The largest airlift campaign in the world is already in full swing, with American cargo planes ferrying troops and heavy vehicles to Europe. However, even America's impressive logistics fleet is simply not enough to move large enough quantities of equipment for an offensive. For now, Ukraine is on its own, and Russia is pouring all available manpower into the conflict before the U.S. arrives. Hour 40. Russia does not wish to antagonize other NATO members, thus expected incursions into the Baltics never materialize. Neither do long-range strikes against America's most important bases in Germany. Instead, Russia scrambles to put together a massive offensive in the east of Ukraine. Its strategy is simple. If it can overwhelm Ukrainian defenses, then it can deny the U.S. the very country it's trying to push Russia out of. But the Ukrainian defenders are resilient as ever, even as Russia mobilizes its reserve battalion tactical groups for battle. This will put tens of thousands of additional troops in the east of Ukraine in the next few days, overwhelming the defenders. Meanwhile, inside Russia, an emergency draft is instituted. Hour 42. Hastily prepped for their missions, American B-2 bombers have been flying from home bases in the continental U.S. for the last 17 hours. Now, the stealthy planes have penetrated deep inside Russian air defense zones and unleashed their cargo on Russian radar and communication hubs inside of Kaliningrad. The goal is to shut down the military enclave's ability to defend itself from air attack, and thus pin massive contingents of Russian forces down, preventing them from launching an offensive into Poland. 2 B-2s are lost in the attack, but the damage to Russian communications and air defense infrastructure is significant and greatly expands gaps in air defense coverage. The U.S. Navy takes advantage of these gaps by launching additional missile strikes, supplemented by strike aircraft from carriers in the Mediterranean and ready forces stationed across Europe. The U.S. Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses, or SEAD mission, is slowly but steadily stripping away Russian air defenses inside the military enclave. Russian fighters alone are no match for American planes with superior sensors, electronics, and weapons, but working in conjunction with very robust air defenses, they become a serious threat. Dozens of aircraft are destroyed on both sides of the conflict, as Russia tries to keep its air defenses online and deny the U.S. and Polish the skies. Hour 60. A Russian attack submarine scores a devastating blow on an American destroyer operating inside the Baltic Sea. This is one of Russia's most modern subs, and while not as capable as American counterparts, still a significant threat to the U.S. Navy in turbulent waters of the Baltic Sea. The submarine is pursued relentlessly by surface vessels working in conjunction with the airborne ASW aircraft, but manages to slink away, using a heavy storm as cover. Hundreds of American sailors die in the attack, and a multi-billion-dollar ship sinks beneath the waves. The Russian surface navy has yet to show itself in battle, sticking close to shore where it's too dangerous for U.S. forces to target them. Day 4. A flood of cyber attacks rocks both Russia and the U.S., with both sides unleashing the full force of their cyber warfare capabilities against the other. The damage to civilian infrastructure on both sides is intense, but the U.S. proves more robust, and within 48 hours American markets are operating as normal again. Day 6. The war over Kaliningrad has reduced Russia's local air defenses to small bubbles of protection, but at the cost of many American aircraft. The enclave, however, is now being mercilessly pummeled from the air as American B-52s launch punishing sorties from their home bases in the United States. Supply and logistic hubs are being set up inside Europe to allow the big planes to be closer to the action, and thus fly more sorties. But for now, the planes must make the day-and-a-half round trip to strike their targets and return home, slowing down the pace of the offensive. However, the vast amount of firepower each plane brings to the fight is devastating for Russian forces. With ground-based air defenses severely attrited by the air and missile strikes, American and Polish fighters can now fly air superiority missions over Kaliningrad, daring Russian MiGs to rise up and meet them. As shown in Ukraine, the Russian Air Force is not nearly as capable as once believed, though it is still very numerous. The US has many times more planes, but for now they're not in Europe, bringing a numbers parity to both sides. US and Polish forces, however, have the advantage with superior sensors, while Russia has the advantage in maneuverability and thrust-to-weight ratio, making their planes deadly in dogfights. Unfortunately for Russia, the age of the dogfight is gone, and most engagements are carried out from beyond visual range. Scores of aircraft are downed in the fiercest air battles since World War II, with the losses heavily on the Russian side. By the end of the first week of fighting, Kaliningrad is under serious threat from the air, but the United States has expended vast amounts of munitions in the attacks and must pause air operations to give time for rearming and refitting. For a few days, all is eerily quiet over the skies that were recently roaring with the sound of dueling jet fighters. Week 2. At the start of the second week of fighting, U.S. forces have begun to amass in Europe in significant numbers. It'll still take time for them to prepare for battle, and even America's vast logistics fleet will take months to ferry the U.S.'s firepower to Europe. However, smaller and more mobile forces have already begun the trip to Ukraine, and a large number of attack helicopters are being amassed to repel the Russian ground assault in the Donbas region. They're simply waiting for the refitting of the U.S. Air Force so it can provide the needed air cover. New Russian battalion tactical groups have entered Ukraine after being hastily prepared for combat. However, the hasty preparations have wreaked havoc on Russian supply chains, which have already been struggling even before the broadening of the war. Now Russian vehicles and personnel find themselves stalled out in massive convoys reminiscent of Russia's failed push to Kyiv. U.S. aircraft take the opportunity presented to them, but only the F-35 can penetrate dangerous skies still not secured by proper seat operations. Forced to carry weapons internally, the F-35s are very limited in firepower, and the attacks do little real damage to the massive formations of enemy troops. However, they are a massive morale boost to the beleaguered Ukrainian defenders who have been dreaming of the day U.S. air power would come to their aid. As the second week of fighting comes to a close, the Russian offensive in the east once more bogs down. This time, though, because of Russia's crippling lack of logistics, Ukrainian defenders take the opportunity to pull back and create some breathing room, resupplying and redeploying to new defensive positions. Russia attempts to use air power to pummel the Ukrainian front lines, but very quickly discovers this to be a mistake. Lurking over the skies of Ukraine are a number of American F-22 Raptors. Deploying under the Rapid Raptor program, the premier air supremacy fighter in the world was some of the first American aircraft to arrive on scenes. While Russia can threaten Ukrainian airspace with air defenses based on its own soil, the Raptors are too far away from these defenses for detection. Russian aircraft experience significant losses before the air offensive is abruptly terminated. Week 4. The 1st American Armored Brigade combat team has crossed the border into Ukraine. A second quickly follows. An expected offensive by the U.S. and Poland into Kaliningrad never materializes, as the U.S. doesn't wish to provoke Russia into using nuclear weapons by physically invading its territory. Instead, Russian troops inside the military enclave are suppressed by ongoing air campaigns against them. America has achieved not air supremacy but air dominance in the region. For the first time in history, Russian and American armor clash in combat. Both sides have prepared for this conflict for decades, but after the end of the Cold War, corruption and a weak economy has hollowed out Russia's once formidable capabilities. The first assault comes in the dead of night. US forces down to the individual soldier are all equipped with night vision. Russian forces, on the other hand, only have night vision and thermals on their heavy vehicles, with a smattering of night vision devices across their infantry. America owns the night, and the ferocity of the offensive rocks the Russian forces to their core. Russian battalion tactical groups are massive beasts with a very heavy top-down command structure. US forces, however, enjoy a great degree of autonomy and are encouraged to seize the initiative. While the Russian BTG is superior in numbers, the US attacks using smaller, much more maneuverable forces. The confusion of fighting in the dark with few night vision capabilities only makes the situation worse for the Russian defenders. Russian T-90s, T-80s, and T-72s have struggled against Ukrainian tanks. Against modern M1A2C Abrams equipped with the latest upgrade packages fighting in the dead of night, they're decimated. Guided to their targets by superior sensors and fire control computers, Abrams' silver bullets bore through thick Russian armor, the edges burning away, creating a self-sharpening penetrator that leads to an extremely emotional event for the Russian crew. Russian tanks fire back with cannon-fired anti-tank missiles, but America has sent the very tip of its spear into this first fight. While not every American Abrams has been equipped with a trophy countermeasure system, the tanks leading the charge into Russian lines have been, and the Israeli-developed countermeasures prove an able defense against the few Russian tanks to survive initial contact. The problem for Russian armor is that American tanks are engaging them from greater distances than they're capable of, thanks to the superior fire computers and sights the Abrams are equipped with. While in Ukraine, Russia has failed to use its infantry to screen its armored forces against anti-tank kill teams, the US makes no such mistake, and the offensive is partnered with mechanized infantry forces who quickly engage and neutralize pockets of resistance left behind in the wake of the overwhelming armored assault. Once more, US forces' abilities to see in the dark gives them an insurmountable advantage over the far less technologically sophisticated opponents. Close air support aircraft work in conjunction with the ground assault to pummel Russian positions. Vaunted A-10 Warthogs unleash hell from their massive GAU-8 Avenger 30mm cannons, while F-15s and F-35s provide air cover against a potential incursion by Russian MiGs. Standoff attack munitions have devastated many of Russia's long-range air defenses located in theater, and SEAD operations have greatly attrited many of the air defenses just over the Russian border that could threaten Allied aircraft inside Ukraine. The campaign has come at a steep cost for the U.S. Air Force and Navy, but the benefits are worth the price, as American close air support aircraft mercilessly pummel Russian positions. Short-range air defenses are much more difficult to target and destroy, and a number of American Apaches fall prey to these and man-portable shoulder-fired air defense weapons. The tough A-10s prove far more difficult to bring down, however, constructed to survive exactly this type of large-scale combat during the Cold War. Overall, though, Russian air defenses managed to score only minor losses on the U.S. air fleet before they themselves are destroyed. While Russia has completely failed to conduct combined arms operations, the U.S. teaches Russia's underfunded and poorly trained forces a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare. Week 5. Additional American Armored Brigade combat teams make the transition to Ukraine. U.S. forces relieve Ukrainian forces along the front of Russia, giving the exhausted defenders a chance to rest and recuperate. The main thrust of the American advance is toward Kherson, with the U.S. forces currently engaged in urban fighting against Russian forces for the liberation of the city. American infantry is well versed in urban combat thanks to 2 decades of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the terrain favors the defenders. U.S. casualties are significant, but with air superiority and superior training, U.S. forces are pushing the Russians out of Kherson. The local civilian populations that remain in the besieged city welcomes the Americans as liberators and aids them in the struggle against Russian forces, only complicating matters for the Russians. Outside of Kherson, the U.S. Special Operations Forces conduct daily nighttime raids against Russian logistics networks, crippling resupply operations into Kherson. The advantage U.S. troops enjoy during nighttime gives them the significant edge over the Russians, as does the fact that the local civilians throw their full support behind the Americans. Along the Polish-Kaliningrad border, skirmishes are common, but there's no full-scale fighting. Polish forces have created a massive defense front in order to keep Russians from encroaching into Poland. But by now, U.S. and Polish air forces have completely destroyed Russia's air defense networks in the military enclave. Any Russian forces that would threaten Poland come under immediate attack. Losses have been steep for both nations' air forces, but Russia losses have been steeper. Not only are Polish and American aircraft far more modern, but Russia's legacy of internal corruption and poor maintenance haunts it as it tries to fend off constant air attacks. Sortie rates for Russian aircraft plummet almost immediately and never recover enough to create a viable defense. To make matters worse, the shortage of critical electronic components has also crippled Russian air defenses. Already during hostilities with Ukraine, the Russian military was running out of air defense missiles, But now, all of its stockpiles for use in case of war with NATO have been nearly exhausted, and there's no domestic replenishment available. Within another week or two, the Russians will be reduced to Cold War-era anti-aircraft cannons, which are completely ineffective against high-altitude targets, though still pose a threat to low-flying aircraft. At the end of the first month of fighting, the Russian military is in dire straits. It's already exhausted by 2 months of fighting in Ukraine. The majority of U.S. ground combat power is not yet in theater, but well on its way, and what elements are already operating inside of Ukraine are putting incredible pressure on demoralized and exhausted Russian troops. U.S. losses are light, Russian casualties are steep, and many of its gains in Ukraine are being reversed. The U.S. has yet to initiate a large campaign against Russian forces, waiting until the bulk of its fighting units are inside the country before launching a massive blitz across the 800-mile front in the east of the nation. For now, the Americans are reinforcing Ukraine's exhausted defenders and relieving them for much-needed reconstitution and resupply. Only in Kherson have the Americans launched a true offensive with the goal of opening a corridor to Crimea. Week 6. Ukrainian forces and their American allies end the Russian occupation of Kherson. The city is the only place U.S. forces have sustained significant casualties. All along the wide-open plains of eastern Ukraine, American forces have remained in defensive postures, repelling initial attempts by the Russians to push them back. Now the front settles into a strategic stalemate as the U.S. waits for the arrival of the bulk of its firepower. In the air, however, the war continues. U.S. forces work day and night to attrit Russian air defenses. The use of drones, standoff attack munitions, and F-35s help curb what would otherwise be very high casualties, as does the fact that Russia is rapidly running out of air defense missiles. Turkey allows the passage of U.S. Navy ships into the Black Sea, leading to a brief but intense confrontation between the Russian and American navies. The Russians managed to sink 2 American destroyers in exchange for nearly their entire Black Sea fleet, which is forced to remain in port or operate under the threat of being sunk. Those ships are soon destroyed at their moorings by the American stealth aircraft. U.S. Marines arrive in Odessa to bring preparations for an amphibious assault into Crimea. Week 9. In one of the fastest mobilization efforts in history, the United States has surged vast amounts of combat firepower to Ukraine over the course of 2 months. The battle for Ukraine is ready to begin in earnest. Week 10. Russian forces have had their supply lines continuously disrupted by U.S. air and special forces operations. Ammunition is low across the front, as is food, medicine, and morale. Russia has entered this war with an insufficiently large enough logistics fleet, and now after the destruction of hundreds of its trucks, its logistics networks are close to complete collapse. Russian forces have been forced to pull back dozens of miles across the front, but not due to military action, because supply lines are needed to be shortened in order to keep units resupplied with a diminished transport fleet. 20,000 additional Russian forces have surged into the nation, the vast majority of them conscripts. These soldiers are poorly equipped and suffer from extremely low morale. The front has been quiet for 2 weeks, but all of that is about to change. In a blistering nighttime attack, U.S. forces surge forward across the wide front in eastern Ukraine. The use of nighttime operations throws the Russians into disarray as they still lack night fighting capabilities in any significant number. Only in the cities is the offensive slowed, as the fighting becomes a block-by-block slog that favors the Russian occupiers. A thrust into Crimea splits Russian forces into 2, as simultaneously U.S. and Ukrainian Marines launch an amphibious assault outside of Sevastopol. The operation is a costly one. Russian resistance is stiffer here after 8 years of occupying Crimea. However, the rapid advance of American armor into Crimea cuts off Sevastopol from the rest of Russia. Rather than attempting to take the city by force, U.S. and Ukrainian forces surround it and seal it off from resupply, allowing civilians to flee through humanitarian corridors while keeping Russian forces pinned down. Cut off from outside supply, they will eventually either starve to death or be forced to surrender. With U.S. forces in sight of Mariupol by the end of the week and 100,000 Ukrainian troops trained and equipped in the last 2 months, Russia faces a choice: admit defeat in Ukraine and retreat to its own borders, continue in a senseless defense of occupied territories that is doomed to failure at great cost to its own troops, or widen the conflict through the use of nuclear weapons. In what's become a modern desert storm, U.S. forces and their Polish allies working in conjunction with Ukraine's defenders have rolled back most of Russia's gains in a matter of weeks. The deciding factors are superior morale, training, equipment, and the fact that Russia has been unable to properly resupply its forces for weeks. But victory hasn't come without a cost to the U.S. and Poland. Thousands are dead and wounded, and the loss in aircraft is significant. Stockpiles of air defenses and ground attack missiles have also been greatly depleted. Replenishment will take years and leave the U.S. military vulnerable to any sudden aggression by China in the Pacific. One of America's greatest modern weaknesses is the lack of a robust industrial mobilization capability, leaving it to resupply losses in missiles and equipment through a slow, steady trickle that will take the better part of a decade. Now get ready for the end with World War III hour by hour, or click this other video instead.